In the 40 years between 1870 and 1910, the United States experienced technological growth that was unparalleled in history. This growth changed everything about life in America and gave us much of the world that we know today. In our series of podcasts about these technological innovations, we now continue to part 2 of our examination of the development of automobiles and Henry Ford's assembly line. My name is Dr. Rick Gardner from Columbus State University, and this is another Muskogee County School District podcast, The Automobile and Henry Ford. In our last podcast, we learned how steam engines were too big for carriages, so the invention of the internal combustion engine was an important alternative. Now, automobiles used to cost a huge amount of money because it took a long time to make them, and not very many people knew how to make them. Well, Henry Ford contrived a way to make inexpensive automobiles. Henry Ford of Detroit, Michigan, began contemplating a way to refine and expand on the ideas of the American inventor Eli Whitney, who advocated interchangeable parts and production lines. In other words, Whitney believed that all products should be made to the same specifications. For short, we call them specs, such as sizes, so that if one part of the product breaks, that part can simply be replaced by a part that fits exactly to the same specs. Otherwise, if you have a product like a gun and the trigger breaks off, you have to get a whole new gun. But if there are interchangeable parts, you can save a lot of money simply by purchasing the new part. Eli Whitney also advocated the idea that when the product is made, it should be made in parts and then assembled. Well, Ford understood this concept and he applied it to the creation of automobiles. Ford's idea radically changed America and the world. Using Eli Whitney's ideas, Ford pioneered the idea of an assembly line. The assembly line would be a way to make cars both quickly and inexpensively. Why? Well, first, because it would involve a whole lot of people working together to make the cars. And secondly, because the people who were making the cars were not skilled nor educated. So how is it that uneducated and unskilled people could build a motor? Well, each one of these workers only had to learn a very narrow, basic, simple task. It might be just screwing one part of the engine together, and then the motor would move down a conveyor to another unskilled worker who would perform another very narrow, very basic task. You see, the workers only had to learn one simple task, but at the end of the assembly line, an entire motor and eventually an entire automobile would be built. Although none of the men who built the automobile knew how it was built entirely, because they only knew their own individual part, together they built lots of cars, fast and cheap. Now, because they were unskilled workers, Henry Ford didn't have to pay them much. And yet $5 a day seemed like a whole lot to them. But since Ford didn't have to pay his workers much, he didn't have to charge much for his cars. He charged about $350 for one of his best cars. The end result was that a lot of middle-class Americans bought Fords in the early 20th century. The most popular Ford was a car known as the Model T. Of all the cars that existed in 1918, more than half of the cars in the world were Ford Model Ts. Another important way in which Ford Motor Company changed America was giving black people a new job market. You see, beginning about 1910, a shift called the Great Migration occurred as blacks left the southeastern part of the United States and moved to the north. One of the biggest draws became Detroit, because Ford had his assembly line there. Ford even sent some of his recruiters into the southern states to lure blacks to come to Detroit and work for him. So Detroit earned the nickname of the Motor City, and later they called it Motown. In the 20th century, it became one of the cities in the United States most highly populated by blacks. Later, a black record producer in Detroit named Berry Gordy would launch one of the first major recording studios primarily for black artists. His record company was called Motown, and he recorded highly successful artists such as Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Lionel Richie, and Michael Jackson. In the 21st century now, auto manufacturing in the United States became greatly challenged by the overseas manufacturers such as Japan's Toyota and Korea's Kia. Detroit fell on very hard times. One of the principal automobile companies, General Motors, almost went bankrupt had it not been for a bailout by the United States government. But Ford's company is still strong. With great changes in automobile technology such as hybrids and smart cars and biofuels and even solar energy, the Fords of tomorrow will likely be almost unrecognizable to the makers of the Model T. But when Henry Ford devised the assembly line in Detroit, the United States entered a new era, and almost all of us, this certainly applies to me, remain entirely dependent on the internal combustion motor for the bulk of our transportation needs. Henry Ford left a deep, deep mark on the history of this nation by coming up with the assembly line in Detroit. My name is Dr. Rick Gardner from Columbus State University. This has been another Muskogee County School District podcast, The Automobile and Henry Ford.